Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Her Name is John, written by Farhelp 6106. It was the first time that Atraxas had invited the boys to his abode. He was frantic and trying to make sure that everything was just right. His wife, Dwana, snapped at him. "Stop it, Atra. It'll be fine. They're just humans, after all." She was sitting in her chair, cradling her sleeping daughter. Atraxas didn't respond and kept on cleaning the already clean room. Dwana sighed and asked, "So, when are you going to tell me what you're going to call this little one?" The couple, as part of the Taraxian people, had always kept to tradition. In their culture, the naming of a new life was given to the male, even more so in a military family. And so Dwana had held her tongue and had waited for Atraxas to tell her what they were going to call their daughter. But still, the wait was getting her. Atraxas didn't immediately answer, but when he did, it seemed to be a non sequitur. "The boys will be here at any moment." As if on cue, the front doorbell rang, and Atraxas rapidly walked to open it. Dwana was right behind him and tried her best to quell the feeling of discomfort at her mate's behavior. He stood on his unsteady legs as he invited the 6 humans and their spouses into their room. Dwana put on a false smile and played the role of the dutiful host. Dwana looked at the men standing at her front door, typical warrior class. Those dull eyes, those blank faces twisted into a travesty of a smile. She stood silent as she watched her husband clasp each one of the men and invite them into their home. She couldn't help but feel that she would have helped wash every surface they touched with industrial-level cleaning products once they were gone. Atraxas gave them the tour of the house as Dwana was left to host the woman. Dwana ground her teeth and offered each one of these females a drink. The women all started chatting happily, leaving the men to get their own libations. Dwana listened in, and as his woman talked about kids, school, the latest fashion. Every so often, one of them would compliment Dwana about something, her home, her skill for interior decoration, her cooking. Dwana started to relax as these female humans seemed to at least be somewhat civilized. As she made her way between the kitchen and the foyer, Dwana picked up on the men's conversation. It was what she expected from them. Crude, bland, boisterous. They were only human, after all. What confounded her was her mates joining in. Atraxas was just as crude as the others. Dwana was even more appalled as she watched her mate allow these men to grab the back of his neck and bring him closer until finally they were forehead to forehead. Dwana couldn't believe her eyes when these 4 arms clasped each and every one of them. That type of hug was reserved for blood relatives or, like her and Atraxas, mates. She couldn't dwell on it too long as she brought more food. She listened to the men and heard them talking about their latest deployment. Atraxas never talked about what he did when he went to fight for their freedom. She had come to terms with that. She remembered the first time he had gone off to fight the war. He had only been 20 back then, full of bravado. She remembered how he seemed darker when he came back from the first mission, and that was even before they had met the humans. She tried to make him open up, but the more she tried, the more Atraxas clamped up. Over the course of their many years together, she had learned not to ask. He would tell her what he could, when he could. But now, here he was, talking about what had happened during their last mission. Dwana couldn't help but feel a little betrayed. Atraxas and her were supposed to be a pair, even more so now that they were parents. This would have to wait until these people were gone, but she was definitely going to be having words with him. The gathering was a mixed bag. The women were polite as they started nibbling on the food Dwana had taken so long to make, while the men surrounded Atraxas, slapping him on the shoulder and the back, grabbing his neck and forcing his face to their chest. Dwana couldn't help but be repulsed by this behavior. She looked at the women who were apparently all ignoring the untoward display. In fact, the human woman had moved to the back of the room where her daughter slept. Dwana felt her heart tighten as the woman leaned in and looked down at her little girl. She could feel her heart quicken as these human females bared their teeth in a characteristic display of pleasure. When the humans had been discovered, a little over a century ago, everyone had freaked out, thinking that this was a sign of aggression. And despite the humans' reassurance to the contrary, Her people still felt the smile thing that the humans did was indeed a threat. Instinctively, Dwala quickened her step, closing the gap between her baby and the human females. She hurriedly picked up her sleeping daughter and brought her to her chest. This, of course, woke the baby up. She started screaming at the top of her lungs. Dwala started swaying from side to side, trying to get her daughter to quiet down. The woman offered their help and a lot of advice, but this only served to aggravate Dwala. It was their fault that her child was upset. She quickly walked back to the foyer, her crying baby in her arms. These humans had made her child cry, and these humans had been invited here by her husband, so it was obviously her husband's fault. She made it back to her husband, dumping the child into his arms. She huffed, "She's awake. I need to take the appetizers out of the oven." Atraxus didn't know how to respond as his wife put their screaming offspring into his lap. Instinctively, he started bobbing up and down, trying to make his daughter quiet down. The men around him looked on in silence at Atraxus' predicament. Then one of them, Jack, said, "Still feels weird knowing the little blip on the scan you showed us back then is making so much noise." The men nodded and chuckled softly. Dwala watched as a few men stepped forward and gently gazed at her baby. Dwala felt that feeling of dread wrap around her heart again. The woman were one thing, but these men... Mike asked, "So what are you calling her?" Dwala knew that the moment had come. Atraxus, who was looking at his daughter, raised his head. She hated seeing that indecision. Now was not the time to show weakness, not in front of these predators. The humans had always worried her. When they had been introduced to the greater galactic community, the humans had always tried to be conciliatory. They had become the traders, the go-betweeners, the deal-makers. This, of course, had made them many friends, but few of the more aggressive races had taken their openness for weakness and had attacked. The humans had, to the shock of everyone in the galaxy, held their own and shown great military prowess. After that, there had been more and more joint military operations involving humans. That's how Atraxus had ended up in that unit. The Sessod, as it was officially known, was a combination of elite forces from before their unification. It had kept their name even though the meaning behind the letters had changed, and Atraxus had been part of the first specialists who had joined the Sessod when the Terraxians and the humans had allied. In fact, he held rank both these people and the humans, specialist first class. The title had earned him respect amongst both his people and the humans. Dwala remembered those days. She remembered a sense of dread when Atraxus came home and told her he was going to volunteer for the Sessod. He had just come off special detachment, where he'd been made to guard their ambassador in a negotiation between humans and Terraxians. What was it he had said when he came back? Oh yes, he said, "The humans are dicks, but, I reckon we can work with them." Dwala had been confused, but she hadn't asked for more. Atra would tell her what he could when he could. Then, over the course of many years, Atra had been on special detachment. Sometimes it was months, often weeks, but Dwala never complained. Her mate was off protecting her from the monsters that lurked in the black, and not once did she complain. Not when she had to keep her household alone, not when she and Anitra had moved to a human world, not when she discovered she was pregnant when he was deployed, not when he'd come back and had to spend months in the hospital, and all he would say was that they had lost one. There had always been a distance between them, and that distance grew every time he came back from deployment. It never lasted. He was the same old Atra after a few weeks. There were sometimes those nightmares where Atraxa woke up screaming and terrified. On more than one occasion, Dwala had to rock her mate back to sleep as he mumbled, "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. I'm sorry." Sometimes what he said changed. She remembered one time when he had woken in the middle of the night, screaming, "Don't do it, Lieutenant! No!" That had been a long night for the two of them. Dwala had tried to make him open up, but Atra would never speak of what he had to do to keep her safe, and so she never complained. Not once. She learned to wait until he was ready to share, to open back up and become a Terraxian she'd fell in love with. In the meantime, she would be there for him and do whatever she could. Her husband would name their child when he was ready. The fact that he decided to share the most intimate moments with these brutes grated, for sure, but Dwala would do her duty. And so she smiled. She laughed at the human's jokes. She played the role of the perfect mate for Atra. "Hey, Atra, what you guys calling this little one?" Dwala clicked unhappily as this human using her pet name for her partner. The room quietened down. Even Dwala couldn't help but feel a happy buzz coming from everyone here. She looked at her daughter and secretly hoped that Atraxas would choose her own mother's name. She had not been against it if Atra chose his own mother's name. It would break with tradition, but Entama was a certain ring to it. Dwala turned her head to look at her husband. He was looking at his daughter, and softly said, "Her name," and paused a second, "is John." The host of soldiers stood silent as their blank faces broke, and tears started brimming in their predators' eyes. Some of their wives seemed to understand that this means something to the men, and took their husbands in their arms. Dwala watched as these strong men, these soldiers, broke into quiet sobs. She looked at her husband, seeking understanding. But when she tried to catch his attention, she realized that it wasn't her approval he was seeking. It was the men's. Dave cleared his throat, and his voice barely controlled the croak. "It's a good name." The rest of the unit nodded, and James added, before bursting into tears, "A strong name." And the little one started crying for food. End of story. Story number 2. Rules Are Made to be Broken, written by Garrick. Deep interstellar space. A small group of spaceships dropped out of FTL and linked their comms networks. "Thank you all for arriving in such a timely manner. I expected nothing less from you all. I have a target, one that'll make us all rich. There is a client that is willing to pay handsomely for us to raid a space station and download all data and take samples of materials of everything in there. 5 mil credits to each of us, and the best part is, it'll be barely defended." "That sounds too good to be true," one of the captain's privacy avatars declared. "I know, but I have looked their plan over, and it seems foolproof. The station is orbiting a gas giant in the Demeter system. That's the human system. We can't attack them. They are subject to the Akuri Dominion, and the Akuri do not like it when you raid their subjects. If a patrol happens to be present or nearby, none of us would get out." "I know. But ever since their defeat, the humans are only allowed to build a few minor warships for inter-system defense. We'll go in threatening to raid their world for slaves. They'll withdraw their fleet to defend the world, and then the space station will reopen to raid. We'll be in and out before they even know what hit them." "And when the Okuri battle group on our tails, when the humans call for protection, you're mad." "Ah, but there is where my client came through. I have software designed to spoof the Akuri Defense Net satellites and put them in maintenance mode. No one will be able to call for help, and it'll look like no one entered the system. And I also have the patrol schedule for the enforcement fleets. If we go in at the right time, we can be out a week before the next patrol." After some negotiations, 2 of the other vessels decided to join the venture, with a third opting out. Demeter system, 2 weeks later. "Please, Captain, we are but peaceful farmers. The Akuri do not allow us to be anything else. We have nothing of value. What can we do to appease you?" With a curt gesture, the captain cut the communication from the planetary governor. Her pleading had gotten on his nerves, and his prize was getting close. The plan had worked exactly as intended, and the small group of ships was approaching the starbase, which clearly was undefended. Scanners showed the human vessels had taken up a defensive position over their planet, and by the time he changed course, it was too late for them to act. "Captain, the Harino, she's been destroyed. I can't get anything on the scanners, but whatever it was, it took her out in a single blow." The panic shout of his bridge crew shocked the captain as much as the news. "Evasive, and find out what that was. Contact the Yugrin and ask if they saw anything." Once contact was established, the captain of the Yugrin was shocked enough to not have an avatar, but just the direct feed of his bridge. "We saw nothing either, and our scanners are coming up empty. We're trying to visual and, oh gods, what is that?" Communications cut off, but for a split second a massive object was seen breaking into the bridge, ripping through the armor as if it was paper. "Go to visual now!" The crew looked on in horror as they saw massive objects using what looked like tentacles ripping the Yugrin apart, but were brought back to reality when they saw it let go and turn to them. Even without the order, the crew fired everything, only to see their missiles intercepted by what looked like a small parasite flying from the thing's back, and their energy weapons just dissipated on its outer layer. "Contact the humans and try and get out of the gravity well. Get away from that thing." Captain, was there something?" The human governor suddenly looked far too composed for the captain's liking. You violated the subjugation protocols. Once I let the Curie know of your species will be punished like no one before. I'm transmitting the data now, unless you let me go and transfer all your funds to this account immediately." "The captain, I'm wounded. We have not violated anything. We are not allowed to build any ships larger than frigates, nor go above certain numbers. And you'll see that our ships here follow those demands exactly. It never mentioned anything about breeding new and exciting life forms. That is not a battleship. That is our lovely mascot. Squiggy. And Squiggy is a bit playful and hungry. Oh, and Captain, how are you going to transmit anything with the Akuri satellites in maintenance mode?" The captain looked at the communication hologram in shock. How did you know the—" He never got to finish the sentence as a massive tentacle ripped through his hull. A deep underground base, lunar, 4 weeks later. So, as you can see, the operation went exactly as planned. The Squigoth-class behemoth is capable of approaching cruisers undetected and ripping them apart without any effort. Extrapolation suggests that they will be able to stand toe-to-toe with the Akuri battleships. The genetic material has been distributed to all our colonies as of now. "Thank you for your presentation, Governor Maizaki. And we are sure that we'll be no witnesses?" "No. There was a third vessel invited by the pirate captain, but we managed to intercept and destroy it. As far as everyone knows, those vessels just vanished, as pirates often do." "Dr. Rodriguez, how long?" "Given we start the breeding program now, we can have enough Squigoths trained and operational to have parity with the Akuri in 5 years. In 10 years, we'll outnumber them significantly." "Then our main concern is how to keep things secret. We commence at once." End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.